4%.
Would you ask Mr. Reason to come back in, please?
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Reason, let's see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there are a few. Can I start, please, with this question? You, I think, told us on Monday of this week that watch managers get a basic 5-day training for trainers module. I think that's what you told us.
That's correct.
And for our reference purposes, that's day 180 at pages 187 to 189. Now, I wonder whether that's really correct. Can you clarify that you were referring only to the pre-Babcock era? In other words, before and or in 2012?
Yes, because I was the head of training in 2009 when the crew manager development programme was launched, or a revamped crew manager development programme was launched, and that included a 5-day module, as I described in my evidence on Monday. But yes. I don't know if that was carried through into the Babcock training contract.
Well, that's the question. To be clear what we're talking about the basic training skills module, the BSTM, yes?
Or something equivalent to that, yes.
Yes. Do you know why it wasn't carried over into the Babcock training programme?
No, I don't, I'm sorry.
Right. Should it have been?
Possibly. I didn't work on the contract, so I don't know.
Right. Next question is about qualitative assessment of the number of IMPD returns for station-based staff as against the totality of incidents. We looked at this with Rita Dexter when she gave evidence, and we looked at the document, we can go back to it if necessary, which showed that there was about a 4% return positively in circumstances where they were not mandatory but optional.
Yes.
Now, I asked her the question whether anybody had ever benchmarked or qualitatively assessed the 4% and asked themselves, is that a fair representative of the figures? And her answer was that you would know more than she did about it. Do you?
Probably a little bit more. The 4%, I don't think we benchmarked the 4%, but the 4% was made up of a number of constituent people that put information on that database, and one of the key groups of staff that regularly put information on was the operational review team. Now they're a small cadre of officers that are mobilised to predominantly 6-pump incidents and above, so incidents that attract more than 6 fire engines and above, and they are our incident management assurance team. They look at incident procedures, but they also look at incident command. And so whilst I don't say that anyone else's comments are not valued, because of course they are, that constituency of officer, they're probably the most busiest officers in the country by some measure. And so their contribution to the IMP gives you a really rich view of what's going on in your organisation, because they are going to all the more significant incidents, and they are such a small cadre of officers that it's much easier to calibrate and benchmark performance against standards when you've got such a small group of staff reporting on it.
Right. Now, let's turn to a different topic. Can I ask you please first to go to LFB 3067827. This is your Exhibit 70, GR70, and it is a report by the Commissioner, Ron Dobson, of the 20th of June 2013 to the authority, and the title is Coroner's Inquests Following the Fire at Lacknell House on 3rd July 2009. And if you look at the summary, it says, this report presents the outcomes from the recent inquests relating to the fire at Lacknell House on 3rd July 2009, in which 6 members of the public tragically lost their lives, and details the actions that the London Fire Brigade, LFB, will be taking in response to the coroner's recommendations. The report also details the financial implications for implementing these actions and describes the governance and reporting arrangements that will be used as a means of monitoring the implementation of the actions. And the recommendation, if you scroll down a bit further, is to note this report, including the cost implications and monitoring proposals, which are detailed in paragraphs 19 to 20. First, did you see this report at the time?
I saw the report when it was presented to the Fire Authority because I used to sit as an officer member on the Fire Authority.
Right. You were an officer member on the Fire Authority. Did you have any input into the drafting of this report?
Only insofar that the action plan that's appended to this is the action plan that I developed with the heads of service, which was signed off by the Commissioners Group prior to the Commissioner responding to the coroner.
Yes, that's the action plans we've been seeing up to that date.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, can I ask you then to go, please, to page 5 in this document, where we will see some bullet points at the head of the screen. The second one says, 2 TCAPs have been completed with Babcock for the proposed training. The first covers the request for a high-rise case study incorporating the learning points from Lacknell House and other high-rise incidents. Babcock are responsible for the design of appropriate training, and it is anticipated this will be computer-based training. The second TCAP enhances existing training for incident commanders and for command and control to address the specific issues raised by the coroner. I'm just pausing there. That's a summary of really what we saw at much greater detail yesterday.
Yes, I believe it is.
The high-rise case study would probably involve contemporary media techniques such as 3D modelling to create a real-time case study and some officer time to support the development. From previous similar exercises, the total cost is estimated at £11,500 to £13,500. The additional costs of the enhanced incident commander and command and control training are anticipated to be minimal and deliverable within existing budgets. My overall question is, did you think that the existing budget or budgets to carry into effect all of the Rule 43 or the responses to the Rule 43 recommendations was sufficient?
Yes, I did.
Did anything ever give you cause to think that they weren't?
No.
Can I ask you then to look at LFB 000085808? Now, this is a document a little bit later. It's an email from Peter Cowup to you, copy to Danny Cotton, AC Cotton, on the 2nd of March 2014. And this, you'll recall, is just about the same time as the comms training was coming out, but it's not to do with that. The first 2 paragraphs say this: we've discussed this topic previously in the context of whether the current PDA of 3 times pumps and an aerial is sufficient. Now the revised high-rise GRA is published, just to be clear about that, that was in the previous month, February 2014, I think.
Yes, it was.
GRA 3.2. Yes. The way is clear for LFB to update our local risk assessment and operational procedure to take into account the new hazards this document records. Much of that work has already been done, and although we have not carried out task analysis, it's clear that some of the new hazards which have been identified invoke control measures that can be personnel intensive. And then there's quite a lot of detail about PDA, and if you go to the second page of this, please, and look at the second paragraph, after the detail, which I can take you through slowly if need be, he says this, in saying that, and what he's saying, that there, in summary, is that if you increase the PDA for high-rise incidents, you lead to a lot more additional appliance movements per annum. That's the point.
That is the point, yeah.
Yeah. He says, in saying that, I am, of course, aware of the sensitivities associated with LSP 5. Just pausing there. Is that London Safety Plan version 5?
That is indeed, yes.
Right. And which are likely to be associated with any recommendation for increase at a time of budget constraints. That said, if a review indicates that it is the right thing to do in order to promote firefighter safety and improve our effectiveness, I would not see those considerations, stroke issues, as insurmountable. First, what did you understand Mr. Cowup meant there in his email to you of at a time of budget constraints?
So, as I said earlier before lunch, that the period, a period from about 2009 to 2016 was a particularly difficult period for the Brigade in terms of budget efficiencies that were imposed on the Brigade by the then Mayor Boris Johnson. So London Safety Plan 5, which covered a period between 2013 and 16, included a number of significant changes in the frontline establishment, 13 pumps reduction, 10 fire station closures, and around 685 frontline posts were reduced as part of that LSP 5 proposal. So my reading of this was that Peter was obviously aware of all of the proposals in LSP5, and he was bringing forward a report which eventually came to ODCB and then went on to Corporate Management Board later in the year to increase the PDA. So I think the term sensitivities around LSP5, obviously that was a difficult period for officers in terms of the interaction with the Fire Authority members and indeed the Mayor, and also the representative bodies that were representing those officers that were potentially going to lose their jobs. So I think he's encapsulating, he was aware as a senior leader in the organisation that there was, considerable opposition to LSP5, and that he was coming forward with a recommendation that would increase the number of fire engines that needed to be mobilised to an initial call to a high rise. And whether that was going to put pressure on the organisation in terms of numbers of resources. Going forward, you might bring me to this, I'm sorry, but the paper that eventually came forward laid out all of the impacts of increasing the PDA. That went forward via ODCB. I think it went to ODCB twice, and then it went forward to the Corporate Management Board, I think in January after I left, and the decision by the Corporate Management Board was to increase the PDA to 4 pumps.
Were these budget constraints of which Mr. Cowap speaks here in this email, which I think you would agree is not to do with a response to the Lakanal Coroner's recommendations?
Yes, it's not anything to do with that. It's to do with the London Safety Plan 5 and the budget.
Yes. Do you agree that, or is it the case that these budget constraints affected in any way the training and other responses to the Lakanal House Coroner's recommendations?
No, I don't believe they did.
Right. Given the time of budget constraints which you've just described, what was the mechanism by which the LFB ensured that the Brigade's response to the Lakanal House Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations were insulated from budgetary difficulties?
I don't think that was ever required because none of the proposals in the Commissioner's response to the Rule 43 recommendations were ever discussed in the context of budgetary constraint. There was never any discussion that I can recall, and I know it to be a fact, that it was not an inhibiting factor. Nothing that we did in relation to responding to the coroner's recommendations was limited or inhibited by budgetary constraints, as far as I'm aware.
Did you ever feel that the budgetary constraints constrained the effective delivery of the Babcock deliverables under its contract?
Not at all. The Babcock contract, as you're probably aware, is a 25-year contract. So the budget provision for the 25 years, and certainly we usually typically budgeted 3 years in advance to take account of the Mayor's advice. That running cost of the Babcock contract was already factored into the LSP5 proposals.
Right. So did you ever feel that the limited budget or budgetary constraints were in any way to blame for the slow production or perhaps poor quality of the training materials?
I don't think they're connected at all.
And on that score, can you tell me why was computer-based training preferred to live teaching?
I don't think it's correct to say it was preferred. It was just a tool in the toolbox that we had to give stations different training opportunities. There is a mix of drill sessions, so that's live training in the drill yard, exercises which are external venues, and as part of the Babcock contract there were 2 brand new state-of-the-art training centres one was opened in my time and the second one opened shortly after I retired, which was really the step change in the contract in terms of being able to do things differently with better facilities. One thing, with your indulgence, I might try and explain to the inquiry, because I think it's relevant to this line of questioning, is a lot of people assume that on the 1st of April 2012, when Babcock took over, there was this significant sea change in the way training was delivered. And whilst I fully accept that the decision to outsource training was a milestone in the history of the London Fire Brigade, in practical terms, we gave the keys to the training facilities, centres, to Babcock. We closed the door on a Friday. Babcock took over from the Monday, and a large percentage, and I can't give you the exact percentage, of London Fire Brigade training staff were either cheaply transferred to Babcock or were seconded. The operational staff were seconded to Babcock to continue the training basically exactly the same as we were doing it, because there was no new training facilities at that time. That was part of the contract, was to build 2 new training centres. And so ostensibly on the Monday, it was the same trainers at the same venues delivering the same type of training, and the only difference the delegates would have seen was, instead of someone wearing a London Fire Brigade logo uniform, they'd be wearing a Babcock uniform. Now obviously that changed over the life of the contract, and that was always planned to do that. So it was a big bang in terms of the contractual arrangements, but the reality for delegates and for the brigade, it didn't really change other than what I've just described. It was the same people using the same venues, the same equipment, and that obviously changed in the first 3 years when I was director.
Right. I'll come back just to explore some questions in relation to that shortly. Can I just ask you before I do, did the LFB ever conduct any sort of study, any kind of investigation into whether CBT was better, more effective as a way of delivering training to station-based staff as opposed to in-person training, teacher-led or interactive?
I don't remember or recall a study being undertaken, but part of the training commissioning process, which we've touched on, and I know you've touched on with other witnesses, once you identify the desired learning outcome, part of that discussion process between the commissioning department and Babcock is how that learning outcome can be best achieved. And the options available to you to achieve that obviously could be face-to-face, CBT, live exercise, and a whole range of other options I'm sure I can't think of now. So it would have been a joint decision by the commissioning department and Babcock in terms of how best to deliver that training to achieve those learning outcomes.
Right. And can you, as you sit there, assure people that the choice of using computer-based training was adopted on the basis of its perceived efficacy and not on the basis of the perceived budgetary benefits?
Yes, I can. I don't think budget came into it, as far as I know.
Now, going back to Babcock, it's right, I think, that you had oversight and responsibility for the functions and departments that made up the ORT. And did that also include interface with Babcock?
Yes, Peter Groves' team came under my directorate.
Yeah, exactly. What was your exact role in liaising with Babcock?
I didn't have a formal, apart from the course review board, which I chaired, I didn't have a formal role in terms of the contract management, but I did take the opportunity at the start of the contract, given that it's a 25-year contract, to introduce myself to the directors of Babcock that were going to be responsible for the Babcock training element of the Babcock contract. And obviously in those early days when there were issues, I'm happy to discuss those if you need me to, we had, I think it was probably diarised on a monthly basis. That probably didn't always happen, but we tried to get together on a monthly basis just to, to discuss where we were and some of the issues. And that was part of trying to develop a kind of partnership working. This is this was going to be a long contract. It was certainly going to outlive my time in the brigade, and it was just trying to one, educate Babcock on some of the challenges for London Fire Brigade senior managers in terms of the political environment, and indeed the budgetary constraints, although it wasn't an issue in this because this has been laid out as a 25-year contract. But just to try and get them to understand our world, and obviously for me to get to understand some of the challenges that Babcock were facing, and trying to work collectively to try and resolve some of those issues.
And Gordon Reynolds, I think, was the Babcock manager of the LFB training contract, with whom you had most contact, is that right?
Yes, he was my primary contact at Babcock.
And how would you normally communicate with him?
Face-to-face, and sometimes on the phone, and occasionally by email, but most substantively would have been face-to-face.
Right. And Did CBT, as a method of delivering training, increase after Babcock took over?
I honestly don't know the answer to that, but the sense I get is yes, it probably did, because Babcock had access to better technology and the capability to design interactive training materials. I suspect that became a more significant option during the commissioning process because of the types of training they could deliver via computer-based training that we couldn't do in-house before that.
Now, you said in the answer before last, somewhere in there, that there were issues that arose in the early part of the relationship. Could you give us a very brief thumbnail sketch of what those issues, as you call them, were?
Yes, so the first significant issue was venues for some of the very specialist types of training, high volume pumping, which you need a large body of water, and it needs to be away from members of the public because of the nature of the equipment that's being used. What had happened, which I think was as a direct result of the short lead-in between contractor Ward and Babcock, in effect, starting to deliver training, that what happened, they didn't have time to do due diligence or check that all the venues that we were using external to our own estate would be available to them. So what happened, I think, in the first week, as an example, we used Chessington World of Adventures for one of our high-volume pump training facilities, and I negotiated that contract with that establishment. So the HVP arrived, it was programmed to be trained, the trainer arrived, it's an LFB ex-trainer, LFB equipment, LFB crew, same venue, and the guy on the gate said, what's going on, you've got a different uniform on, and he said, oh yeah, I don't work for London Fire Brigade, I'm seconded to Babcock, and he said, oh, hang on a minute, you can't come in. And we had a few of those issues happened, and therefore we lost some very specialised training venues in the first quarter of the contract, which we did recover later on, but it took Babcock, understandably, a few months to renegotiate the lease agreements with those venues, or they had to find alternative venues.
Right. Were there any problems relating to the delivery quality of training, or the content quality of training in the early years of Babcock's tenure?
Not that I'm aware of, not any significant beyond what we'd experienced within our own when we were delivering it in-house. As I said in answer to a previous question, the real step change for me came in around June 2014, when the first of the dedicated training facilities, which was at Beckton in North East London, opened, and that marked a significant change. Just one of the drivers for outsourcing, or looking at outsourcing of training, was the fact that our training estate, the LFB training estate, was so dated and old and really wasn't fit for a modern fire service. So the first of the dedicated training facilities opened around June. I think we were using it slightly before that, so when it was officially opened. And then the Park Royal facility, which was another brand new training development, opened shortly after I retired.
Do you recall whether there were any tensions as between Babcock on the one hand and the FBU on the other? You can recall?
Yes, vividly. Understandably, and I do understand this, so this is not a dig at the Fire Brigade Union, I absolutely understood their position. They were resistant to outsourcing the training as a principle, I think that's fair to say. And a number of their members, I think, went above and beyond to try and frustrate the delivery of the contract in the first wave. And we did get some quite poor behaviours, not across the board, but just individuals that really frustrated Babcock's ability to deliver the training in some context. So I was fully aware that the principle of outsourcing was not welcomed by the Fire Brigade Union, and there was some difficult management issues to resolve. But that was kind of the extent of it. But that did improve over time, and I think draw the inquiry's attention to the Ribbon Star report, which I've read in preparation for giving evidence, and I was quite interested in what the author would say about the view of Babcock, and I think it, without trying to remember every word, but I think in the sense that there was a lot of resistance just because it was different and it was not LFB, and I understand that from an emotional point of view, why people would feel that. But I think when you cut through that emotional and they asked the question, well, is training better under Babcock, once we got those initial issues resolved, I think the resounding answer was the majority of staff said training was better under Babcock, because of the facilities and all the innovation that had been brought by the dedicated training centres.
Right. Did anybody explain to you what the principle was that by which the FBU objected to outsourcing?
No.
Have you any idea what it was?
I can only surmise, but I think it was just the principle of outsourcing, which meant a number of staff that used to work for fire service would be seconded to Babcock, and that was a voluntary. We didn't make them go and work for Babcock. We offered them a voluntary secondment for 2 years, and that would be reviewed after 2 years. But I just think they got the sense that they just didn't like the idea of a third party delivering our training. I think, just thinking about it a bit more, one of the other things that they were concerned about was the sector competence of the trainers. But as I said, the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of trainers moved across with the contract, either under duty transfer or secondment. And then in that first period, the Brigade developed a fit for train requirement as part of the contract, which meant all of the trainers had to meet a certain specification in order to be able to deliver training, and that was reviewed annually.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Reason, those are all the further follow-up questions I have for you. It only remains for me to thank you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We're extremely grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
And it's right, Mr. Reason, that I should thank you as well on behalf of all 3 members of the panel. You've given us a lot of your time, and we are very grateful to you for your assistance, which has been considerable.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed for coming along, and you're now free to go.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Millett. Now, we have another witness, but not today, is that right?
No. He is scheduled to come tomorrow. This is Assistant Commissioner Dan Daly.
Yes.
And he will be coming tomorrow.
And in case anybody wonders, we've managed to catch up some time.
Yes.
And as you say, Mr. Daly was invited to come tomorrow, and that's when he will be with us.
Yes. And we were looking at the timetable, and we thought it less wise rather than wiser to leave the timetable as it stood, rather than risk bringing the whole thing forward.
Yes. Well, in that case, we'll rise at this point.
Yes. And
we'll resume the hearing at 10 o'clock tomorrow, when we shall look forward to seeing Mr. Daly.
Very good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, then, please.